Welcome, everyone. My name is Drew. I am the National Coordinator of ICHRP US, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines US Network. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. This webinar is jointly hosted between ICHRP and several church organizations whose we'll flash here in a minute. So the United Methodist Church, the National Alliance of Filipino American United Methodists, the Western Methodist Justice Movement, the United Church of Christ Global Ministries, and the United Church of Canada. So we're thankful for our sponsors of this important webinar tonight. And then ICHRP, Canada, and US are solidarity networks of concerned organizations and individuals campaigning for human rights and just and lasting peace in the Philippines. So this evening, as we begin this webinar, we want to acknowledge that for most of us in North America, we are residing on stolen land. I myself am on land that is ancestral home of the Piscataway and the Nocotchtank people. I'd invite you to name in the chat the ancestral land where you are joining us from this evening, or if you can't type in the chat, to just reflect on it and name them where you are. We repent of our part in perpetuating patterns and systems that wound the relationship with creator and creation between earth and our neighbors. We seek to make a new way together. We understand that our solidarity with the people of the Philippines, that land is life, and we are committed to making this true not only in the Philippines, but around the world. So thank you for joining us tonight for this important webinar on the issue of red tagging and the repression of activists in the Philippines. So as mentioned, ICHRP is a part of an international solidarity network. And today's webinar is a testament that people all over the world care about the human rights violations against and the struggle of the Filipino people. Investigate PH, which is an initiative of peoples from all over the world concerned about what's happening in the Philippines. Investigate PH is currently holding independent investigations on the human rights violations in the country to further substantiate the landmark 2020 report of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Philippines situation, and which will be submitted to the UN and other important legislative bodies throughout the report. Tonight, we'll hear from a group of speakers who are members of the Commission on Investigation and have been witnessing the stories of victims and human rights defenders in the Philippines. And before we hear from the members of the Commission, I'll first introduce my colleague in the Philippines, Joanna de la Cruz, or Chikai, who will share updates on the current situation for us. Chikai is part of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and is United Methodist herself.
Hello, everyone. As Drew mentioned, my name is Johanna La Cruz, and I work as program assistant for the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. And my sharing tonight will be about the attacks perpetrated against mostly the church people under the Duterte administration. And good evening, everyone. So, as Christians, we believe in the inherent dignity of all peoples, regardless of one's belief, denomination, and affiliation. We also believe that rights of persons must be respected, as God's image is in all of us. Unfortunately, under the President Duterte's administration, our inherent dignity as Filipinos are constantly attacked, and the church people are compelled by faith to pursue justice and restore human dignity. So, under the dispensation of President Duterte, something evil was unleashed. His kill policy have hate speech and anti-life pronouncement of the government have emboldened our police and state forces to do hardline violent approaches against its critics, activists, rights defenders, and even church people. Our human rights situation has been continuously alarming as local remedies to accessing justice within the country remains to be practically insurmountable. As the country continues to battle against COVID-19 pandemic, our fragile economy has spiraled down, and many people suffer and remain poor and grew hungry each day. People have lost their jobs and are left with little or no recourse for survival. According to some reports, the hardship faced by Filipinos is actually one of the worst economic situations since World War II. This has meanwhile been exacerbated by the chaotic distribution of food and financial subsidies. People have been forced to violate lockdowns in order to provide and fend for themselves and their families. And amidst the pandemic, violations in the country continue to skyrocket. The government's militaristic approach in curbing the COVID-19 has only brought numerous atrocities to the people, like arbitrary and illegal arrests, extrajudicial killings, and red tagging, only promoting violence and fear to an already vulnerable population. Instead, the government drawing its attention to much needed social aid to the people, the government only continued its anti people policies designed to silence its critics and those who are against the administration. The drug war continued in the Philippines and actually increased by more than 50% during the lockdown, especially in the early months of the 2020 last year. Police reported in November that since President Rodrigo Duterte came into office, nearly 8,000 alleged drug suspects has been killed during operations. This dispensation went as far as making sure that activists, human rights defenders, who are also and also the other people who are in the oppositions are silent through the signing of the Anti-Terrorism Act. This signed act by the president last year holds dangerous provisions and risks. As the anti-terrorism law increases the allowable length of warrantless detention to 14 days up to 23 days without contacting your family or lawyer. The law also allows for months of uninhibited surveillance of any organization or individuals. The law denies the right to due process and have handed over unchecked authorities to the president, paving way for a legally militarized state. On extrajudicial killings, um, according to the rights group Karapatan, around 451 extrajudicial killings have been done uh, up in the past years under the Duterte administration. And seven of these killings are known to be from the church sector. So I'm going to share a picture. So this is Father Tito Paez, he was 72 years old and he was killed in December 2017, along with and 6 months after that, it was Father Ventura and Father Nilo who were also gunned down in their altar in April and June, after 6 months after Father Ventura was killed. Illegal arrests. Um, there was also a lot of uh, illegal arrests that happened, and among the recent and unlawful arrest was Pastor Benji Gomez. He was from the southern part of the Philippines in Mindanao, and he was arrested just a few days ago, last Sunday, after leading worship in service in his church. So the grounds on the arrest was hinged on fabricated charges in 2014. It was actually dismissed, but he was arrested again. Pastor Benji is a UCCP pastor, and he was known to be working with indigenous peoples in the Philippines, the Lumad communities in his area, and is known to be an environmental defender. And also, just last month, a UCCP pastor, Pastor Dan Balucho, who is also a human rights uh, activist and also a humanitarian actor, was he was also illegally arrested, and he was arrested at 3 a.m. because also during the time they were in full swing of doing some humanitarian work in their communities. So apart from illegal arrest, we also have attacks on church people, especially on progressive organizations through red tagging. Smear campaigns against progressive organizations and churches continue in Mindanao, but not only in Mindanao. Actually, it's all throughout the Philippines. Uh, you can. There are also a lot of red tagging of activists, and this red tagging comes in many different forms. It comes from online and offline red tagging, and so you can see some of the pictures here. Sorry, it's not sharing. But anyway, for us, red tagging and branding people as enemies of the state is considered to be a death sentence, a prelude of many other human rights violations, and puts person or an entire community in constant state of fear and insecurity. Um, in November 5, 2019, the Department of National Defense listed the National Council of Churches in the Philippines as part of the front organization of local communist terrorist group, and our office building after that has been frequented by police and some other elements, and they take pictures of our building. And also the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict are actually at the forefront of the business of red tagging and vilification. The NCCP, along with the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, and many other Christian organizations, was red tagged as an open sectoral organization of the communist rebel groups in the country. They posted this in their social media. The branding includes, like I've said before, online and offline vilification. Offline means there are posters that are hanging around in some of the communities, especially in the provinces, and vilifying some of our pastors and some of the human rights defenders or activists in the area. These vilification campaigns even included our General Secretary, Bishop Ruel Maritza. So, despite the many violations that the churches have been subjected to, there has little or no accountability. Those who have committed rights violations face no repercussions, and the Philippine judicial system remains open to manipulation and has been exceedingly slow in delivering justice. There is also a high number of baseless proceedings taken by the military and the police against human rights defenders and political activists. These intended to harass them. Local remedies are becoming more and more difficult to access for those seeking justice. So, most of the church people targeted in this way are those primarily fulfilling their Christian mandate and mission of ministering with the poor and the marginalized. We undertake this prophetic task as Christians to be with the people, especially in times when basic human rights of our people and communities are being undermined. For the NCCP, our Christian mandate compels us to be with the last and the least, and with the poorest of the poor to defend God's image in every human being. Our faith as Christians compel us to accompany and join the people in the struggle in asserting and attaining full rights as God has promised. But because also the situation in the Philippines seemed hopeless, but because we are Easter people and we never lose hope, how do we move forward? So, as churches, we are never alone in the struggle. We have the rising movements from the ground and also the international community. And case in point, this global partnership that we have, and we have different platforms to that. Um, also, Uh, what is the task at hand? Well, for us, it's important to strengthen the international solidarity and also push for accountability in the international area. So we have the United Nations Human Rights Council, we have the ICC, and the EU Human Rights Commission, and even I heard that the Global Magnitsky Act can do can help us in attaining at least a little bit of justice. But of course, one of the things that inspires us to move forward is the uh, rising movements from around the world, and we thank you for that. And I hope we can continue doing this not only in the issues that are happening in the Philippines, but because there are a lot of bad things happening in the world, we can expand it even to our, like for example, Palestinian siblings and other people who have been um, denied of their rights. So good evening. That would be my presentation.
Thank you so much for that sharing, Chikai, and in reflecting on the need for international solidarity. In solidarity today with the people of the Philippines and all over the world as well. So next, I would like to introduce one of our members of the commission, Reverend Michael Blair. Reverend Michael Blair is a member of the Order of Ministry in the United Church of Canada and currently serves the General Council of the United Church of Canada as the General Secretary, a role he began on November 1st, 2020. Michael lives in Toronto with his partner and is the father of 2 adult sons. One is who's a part of the CBC's Tall Boys comedy troupe. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
So good evening, friends. It's a privilege to be with you this evening. In June of 2020, the chief of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Madame Michelle Bachelet, released her report on the Philippines, outlining the serious violations of human rights and systemic and widespread extrajudicial killing, and the near impunity with which government instruments operated in the destruction of the lives and citizens of the Philippines. The UN, in receiving that report, chose not to act in any substantive way to make a difference to the realities that was outlined in the report. Instead, the UN opted for the fact that remedies within the Philippine context could be at play to solve the problems of the violence, the violation of human rights. Investigate PH was established as a group of international folks concerned about the violation of human rights within the Philippines. It is aimed at acquiring information, telling the stories, supporting in many ways the findings of Madame Bachelet, and yet at the same time, it is intended to push the UN to make more substantive decisions around the violation of human rights in the Philippines. It is intended to encourage international actors, governments, and civil society and human rights advocates to take a stand against the unwanted and the continued destruction of human life within the Philippines. So this is a very important process and an important work that needs to be done. For us in the United Church of Canada, Investigate PH is one of the ways that helps us to live into a commitment that we've made of joining with people of goodwill who seek for the mending of God's world. And certainly the lived experience of injustice and violence that the people of the human rights defenders, in particular, church folks in the Philippines are experiencing, are an important part of our ability to respond to this. It is also important for us to be in solidarity with the religious community, the church community in the Philippines. We have a significant relationship as the United Church of Canada with church folks, the NCCP, the UCCP, and other groups within the Philippines. And so for us, it's an act of solidarity to be able to be part of an instrument that seeks to tell the story and to support the evidence of the lack of care and attention to the lives of people in the Philippines. For me personally, it's an important thing to do, not only in terms of my role within the church, but also from my personal experience of being in the Philippines, of understanding some of the struggles and hearing the stories. So Investigate PH provides us with an opportunity to, as it were, shed further light on the struggles that are happening in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend, for relating that to the importance of the role of the church in solidarity and how Investigate PH plays a part of that. So next, I want to also on the Commission on Investigation. Currently, he's the area executive for East Asia and the Pacific for Global Ministries of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and the United Church of Christ, and is based in Cleveland, Ohio. Previously, he served with Global Ministries as the Associate for Global Advocacy and Education, where he worked with international partners on issues of justice, peace, and human rights. He studied religion and politics at Harvard Divinity School and American Religious History at Vanderbilt. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure as well to be here this evening and discussing this important process. I'm going to take a look at the first report and its conclusions. The process that Investigate PH undertook included a systematic listening to direct witness and victim testimony in a series of hearings. As a subcommissioner, I was part of a team that had the opportunity to hear and question a set of cases, 49 in total, that occurred between 2020 and early 2021. We engaged in 2 sessions of plenary hearings during January and February of this year. These cases all dealt with incidents of human rights violations, from harassment to abduction, arrest, detention, and torture, forced evacuations, false charges and violations of freedom and international humanitarian law, and extrajudicial killings. There were violations that occurred in the context of Duterte's war on drugs, his exploitation of restrictions and executive police powers during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as attacks against human rights activists, labor leaders, journalists, lawyers, indigenous leaders, environmental activists, and church workers. After drafting, the initial report of the commission was presented on March 15th and had the following main conclusions. First, the first report concluded that political repression by the state has only intensified this past year since the High Commissioner's report in June 2020. And moreover, the government is demonstrably responsible. State forces are responsible for these, the majority of these human rights attacks. The second conclusion is that the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 and the National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict, which was a provision that was issued by executive order in December 2018. These have been used as tools of the Duterte administration to undertake certain aggressions against human rights activists and other opponents, political opponents. What was particularly compelling to me during these cases was how the use of red tagging has become a cynical means of targeting opponents. The mere insinuation that that targets are communist or terrorist rebels subjects them to legal action and violence, and the mere allegation makes them extremely vulnerable to extrajudicial attacks. A third conclusion is that, contrary to the testimony of the government at the Human Rights Council in the 46th Human Rights Council, is that there's a significant lack of domestic remedies and mechanisms to address these human rights violations. The Philippines may have signed various human rights treaties and possess laws that are supposed to protect human and civil rights, including land rights, but in fact, the government has done little to nothing to protect these rights of their citizens. Moreover, not only has it neglected to protect these rights, but it actively infringes upon these rights when it wills. There were certain recommendations that came out of the first report based on these conclusions. First, the report recommended to the UN and member states to use vigorously international legal mechanisms to hold the government of the Philippines accountable. It said to member states in general that they should be particularly attentive to the actions of the government of the Philippines and to, whenever possible, engage in robust diplomatic pressure to hold the government accountable. It was compelling for those of us in the US, for myself particularly, that we have a role in holding the United States government itself accountable to its obligations as a significant ally of the Philippines. We provide major military aid and financial assistance to the Philippines for its security forces, and we've done an insufficient job in holding the government accountable to the use of that military assistance without violating human rights provisions, contrary to our own laws. Other recommendations of the first report were made to the International Criminal Court to heed the conclusions of the report and to decide whether to bring a case against the Philippines, and to the ILO, the International Labor Organization, to undertake its processes to investigate labor affairs in the Philippines. Finally, there was a strong recommendation to those of us in civil society, including all of us in the religious community, to support Investigate PH, to support the conclusions of the report, to endorse the report, and to raise awareness. It's incumbent upon us to raise awareness about the dire human rights situation and to seek ways for us to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek, for giving an overview of that investigation process. One thing you'll know that's unique about this investigation, given our current context of the last year, is that it's all been conducted online, which you can imagine. But ICHRP as an organization, we often host trips to the Philippines. And then we often host speakers from the Philippines. And one of the groups that we work with closely are the Lumad, who are indigenous tribes of Southern Mindanao. And we are going to go ahead and show a video of a song from Lumad children challenging the issue of militarization and the human rights violations that are happening in their community. So we're going to go ahead and watch that video in between speakers.
Dili ka pwede mo ingon nga mag-step back ni sir kay amo aning school property. Sige na po, pwede lang. Okay, next 2 plus 7. Okay. 9. 9, very good. Go away.
You made a school, an army, garrisons for your cruel war of class exploitation, making our dreams a scattered
So this video is also a reminder to us that the reports and the findings from Investigate PH, even though we don't have the witnesses with us here today, often because of security reasons, because their lives could be under threat, we are able to play witness, and the findings are rooted in the real struggles of people, and also the call of people in the Philippines, like the Lumad children, who are crying out for education and for military to get out of their homelands and for justice for their people. So finally, I'll introduce Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow of the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. She served as the first woman elected president of the United Methodist Church Judicial Council in 2008 through 2012. And she is known for her work and commitment to social justice, and is based here in Washington, D.C. At the United Methodist Building. So thank you, Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you and to share this important evening as we talk about Investigate PH. I do want to say a special word of thanks to my colleagues who have presented this evening. You've covered many important things, and I really appreciate it. The work that I was willing to take on for this Investigate PH really is grounded in what Joanna said, in terms of we are made in the image of God, and all of God's children are endowed with dignity. And the church must stand in solidarity with all those who suffer from human rights violations. And so it's imperative that we make ourselves knowledgeable and listen to those who give witness, and that we then go into the world and share that in order to be in solidarity. I've been to the Philippines a number of times and have really enjoyed it so much. The United Methodist Church, as many of you know, has had a long-standing relationship in the Philippines, and it is a good relationship. And as a United States citizen, it is also a troubled relationship. Our own role in the US has really been a role of colonizing for a long time. And all the effects of colonization have in some way seeped into that culture. And so I think not only is there a Christian moral imperative to be engaged in the Philippines for this purpose, but also as a United States citizen, it's important to begin to try to remedy the sins and repair the sins that we have caused. So that is very important. Another reason to be involved in this work is that it does hopefully bring international pressure to bear. The United States has a particularly important role, both in terms of impacting the resources that are used by the United States government and given to the Philippine government, and have some moral imperative to check those resources and to say, what is it that we as Christians and as United States citizens really think is not appropriate. So we have a special, I think, responsibility because of our history. I will say a little bit about the second report. You've heard about the first report. The second report will deepen the focus on the failure of domestic remedies by examining how the judicial system has failed to uphold the rights of people, how it has weaponized the anti-terrorism law in order to further violate the rights of the people. And we just saw an example of that in the song. And in the process of perpetrating and institutionalizing the concept of impunity. And that is very important, not only that we stand against that, but we guard against that, not only in the Philippines, but in other places around the world. The second report will provide evidence of gross violations and of impunity through the testimony of victim witnesses and expert witnesses covering the three so-called wars on drugs, the coin war against the Communist Party, and the war on terror. The war on drug users in the communities has been extreme, and it is one that must be dealt with and not as a justification for militarizing and weaponizing people. The war against all opponents and dissenters, where the state and its agents attack the political opposition on elections and in governments and all private institutions and mass organizations for the slightest criticism and any critique of red tagging, which is in fact a systemic process leading to arrest and execution. And the war on the Moro people and on the residents of Marawi City, in particular for supporting the rebellion against the Manila government and harboring Islamist terrorist groups. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in these wars so far, and the violations associated with these wars often go by civil and political rights and are centered on international humanitarian law. So it is imperative that church people and people of faith stand in solidarity with one another, and I'm happy to answer a few questions as well. And also the targeting, I would also mention, has been against many categories of people. Attorneys have been targeted, judges have been targeted, teachers, civil rights workers, and church leaders. And this has been brought to light in the witnesses that we have heard, and we have heard very painful and really heart-wrenching stories about the way that the government has weaponized people and targeted and red tagged other communities. So as people of faith, and for me particularly as a United States citizen, I feel that it's very important that we engage in learning about this, understanding, and working against it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend. We'll move on to the question and answer portion. So just a bit, again, if for some reason, if the issue of red tagging was unclear, I think what it really is a practice initially in which the Philippine government will call an activist a communist or associated with the revolutionary movement in the Philippines. But what it ends up being used at is not just calling someone like and associating with them like a certain political stance, but it actually it deems them also a terrorist or someone who's trying to overthrow the state. And so it then becomes a presupposition to killing. So if you'll see many people and activists who are killed in the Philippines, it often it has red tagging prior to it. So just a point there. All right, so it looks like we have a couple questions. All right, so the first one, is the Philippine government aware of Investigate PH? Was it provided a copy of the first report and subsequent ones, and copies of the reports provided to the diplomatic missions at the UN? So any of our commissioners would like to answer that?
Well, I'll take a stab and I think others can add. The Philippine government is aware of Investigate PH. And in fact, on the release of the first report, the Philippine government went after a number of the commissioners, published statements about them, as a way of responding. So they didn't respond to the issues that was lifted up in the report, but they went after individuals who were part of the commissioner, which in some ways was indicative of probably their fear of the report, and was trying to kind of demonize those of us who were commissioned. Some of the commissioners have met with the UN, UNHCR. So there's been some conversation there. And I think there is also a continued move to meet with members of the diplomatic corps of a number of countries.
Thanks so much, Michael, for that question. Okay. All right, here's a good one. Maybe this question is for you, Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, since you were the one who are addressing initially, but and then the other sub-commissioners can go ahead and, or members of the commission can chime in. How do we find the line between taking imposes U.S. will and oppression on the Philippines?
I'm sorry, it went dead for a minute. Can you tell me the question again?
Yeah, I'll just repeat it. So how do we find the line between taking accountability as U.S. citizens for colonization and imperialism without becoming white saviors with intervention that further imposes U.S. will on the Philippines?
I think it's really important that the people of the Philippines ask for what they need and want, and that standing in solidarity with them is critically important. And I think that when it comes to the witnesses that we have heard, they have articulated some of the kinds of actions that would be most beneficial to them.
This is Derek, and I would just echo that and say, fundamentally, the key to not just the integrity of our solidarity, but the effectiveness is to do it in true partnership with the Filipino community, with those that we have a relationship with. That's not just ad hoc, but has a long history of accompaniment. That that they take the lead, or the Filipinos take the lead in that relationship and in expressing what the international community can best do. And we've tried to be faithful to that in the process and in the crafting of these reports, as well as in all of the solidarity work that I feel like all of the religious communities participating in the Investigate PH process do. And with respect to pressing the U.S. government, and Canadian government as well, we're well aware that while we want the U.S. to take a role, that there's always a line between imposition of U.S. policy versus upholding international norms and standards. And to the degree that the U.S. has a voice and a leading role in the international community, it should, at the least, not stand in the way of accountability. And often that's where our advocacy with our own government is crucial, is to say, that we have laws, and that we have a moral obligation to be a good international citizen. So whether it's at the all of the international mechanisms through the UN rely upon compliance of its member states to uphold even things that it's signed. But when it comes to enforcement through the Security Council, the U.S. often plays and as well as other permanent members of the Security Council, play a prohibitive role in enforcing good conduct on the international level. So making the U.S. stand up for its own laws and international law is I think a good part of our advocacy work, and not expecting the U.S. to assert its will, its own national interest.
Thanks, Derek and Susan, for those great answers. I'd just like to add to in our documents, our founding documents as ICHRP, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, we also clarified that the situation in the Philippines is rooted in longstanding historical systemic issues, like you mentioned, around colonialism. And it's really us in the countries who have committed those crimes, who also need to keep our governments and countries accountable for those things. And so that's the framework in which we look at solidarity. And then, yeah, just to reiterate, the following the will and self-determination of the Filipino people and our partner organizations in the Philippines, like the National Council of Churches. Okay, so we have another one here, and also just want to invite Chikai to join in to these questions. Do you have any advice on reaching out to quote apolitical Christian folks about Filipino human rights? We'd like to make those connections with more Christians about the need to get involved.
I think that's a that's a bit of a tough one. I think Susan started out a presentation talking about a kind of a theological framing about understanding, and I think sometimes theology gets in the way of folks really understanding the reality that God is committed to the well-being of all of God's creation. And so in some ways, there's kind of a framing sometimes of the way we read scripture in apolitical ways. And so I think Christian communities or individuals who cannot read scripture as almost a political manifesto, a calling to advocate for rights and dignity and value for all persons, that it's pretty hard to convince, and especially people who come out of the context. And I think it's in some ways those of us who have caught the vision just simply need to continue to do the work to speak boldly about that, and trust that we will find like-minded people rather than spend all of our energy trying to convince people who are caught from a theological imagination. That's lots of work for that to change.
This is Derek, and one way that I try to do it, and I attempted this today. I wrote a brief piece that was just released today called "Red Tagging the Gospel." I actually find it difficult in many audiences in the U.S. to speak about these issues in terms of international law and UN mechanisms that that often not just religious folk, but non-religious folk are more responsive to sometimes to the basic call of the gospel. One of the almost absurd directions that this process of red tagging took over the last couple months um, related to the red tagging of food pantries. Um, During these COVID times in particular, where so many people were in need for basic necessities like food, that street corner food community food exchanges proliferated, and the government in their in their paranoia against communism began to label these organizers and participant recipients of the food pantries as communist. This generated, as it was covered internationally, a good bit of blowback from the community, and I think that it really underlined the basic uh, uh, the very legitimate role that these rights actors, that the church plays in responding to basic needs, that meeting the needs of the people, whether it's for food, whether it's for security, that these are gospel calls. And if you're going to say that that's communist, then you're calling the gospel, you're red tagging the gospel. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have. I mean, we'd love for people to read the report, but if we can simply convey the very cynical and disingenuous use of red tagging as a political smear, that goes against the basic cause of the gospel. I think that that's a very fundamental teaching.
Thank you for those answers. And Shikai did actually have to leave us earlier, so I'm apologizing we won't be able to hear from her, but appreciate the great answers of our members of the commission. So just ending, kind of want to better understand, again, the last questions that's coming through is just, what are really the goals that can be achieved with Investigate PH? What is the outcome that people can use from these reports, both in the realm of the UN or otherwise in their home countries?
I would think, I'll take a stab at that. I think there are a couple of things. The closer it gets to the time of the election in the Philippines, I think the more international pressure that can be brought to bear is very important. And I also think that in our various countries, it's also important that our communities really understand what is happening. So as Derek talked about writing and having videos and showing some of what we can of the stories while protecting the witnesses, but telling the story of what is happening is very important and timely in the next year as the election draws near.
Derek or Michael, any further thoughts from you on that?
Well, I began to think about some of the other actions that we can take concretely, and I don't know, Drew, if you were going to speak about the Human Rights Act, the Philippines Human Rights Act, but there are some very concrete things that we can do here in the U.S. through congressional activity to to respond to what's laid out in Investigate PH reports, in order to get the U.S. government accountable. And as I know, Michael mentioned in the chat that there's been lobbying with the Canadian Parliament as well. But it's very important that we take steps to to use the report as a tool to generate action.
Last word, Reverend Michael.
And I think one of the strengths of Investigate PH is that it is bringing the stories of the experience of the people of the Philippines to an international audience. And I think that that's critical because sometimes out of sight, out of mind. And so it's enabling us to kind of see and hear what is the reality on the ground for the lived experience of folks. And I think in some ways, the using the UN instrument is a way of making sure that the Filipino government doesn't continue to act with impunity. And I think that's part of the goal. So as a UN, as a mechanism where international bodies are, and is to actually bring an end to the sense of impunity that the Philippine government feels in terms of its violence against its own people.
Thank you so much to our members of the commission for those answers, and also for those of you who asked questions and for participating in this tonight. So as Reverend Susan said, there's really a moral imperative for Christians to raise these issues that are happening in the Philippines, and also for people who are located in North America to also raise these to the Canadian and US governments. And I think the beautiful part of solidarity is that it's really based in mutual interest. It's not an act for someone else, but with someone else. It recognizes we have common problems and common issues. And indeed, we do have a common issue that US and Canadian tax dollars every year go to military aid to the Philippines. Even while people in the US and Canada are also suffering poverty, these dollars are going to killings and political repression. And so in terms of action, some of the main points coming out of Investigate PH in the report is to continue to urge the Canadian US governments to cut military aid to the Philippines. So in the US this coming Monday, on June 14th, Representative Susan Wild is introducing the Philippine Human Rights Act into Congress to suspend military aid to the Philippines. And so there's a need for raising the clamor around that so that we can push for the bill to move to a vote in Congress. And then even in Canada, there's been major advocacy around opposing helicopters being sent to the Philippine military. And there's a point in which Canada was able to pause that. And so there are major accomplishments that we can achieve in our solidarity work. Another piece which Chikai mentioned was to use the Magnitsky Act. So in the Magnitsky Act is legislation that came in under the Obama years, in which we can block human rights abusers from entering various countries or freeze assets that are located in the US and Canada. And so that's another way we can act in solidarity to expose the human rights violators and abusers who are also tied to the US or Canada. And lastly, if you can, as much as possible, so our partners in the Philippines are really, doing a lot of work around this project. Behind the scenes, they're going all over the country in the Philippines. And there's a lot of sensitivity to this as well, in that some of these witnesses are being harassed or followed by the military and police. And so there's a lot of hardship that came in being able to witness for this report. And so with that, we're really asking as much as you can to donate to Investigate PH to support our partners on the ground in the Philippines, who are really the ones driving this project. Again, tonight we were witnesses to this, but really, most importantly, what it can be attributed to and what we heard tonight is really the bravery and courage of human rights defenders in the Philippines who are making their issues and messages known internationally. And so just lastly, we want to invite you also to continue in solidarity and to join ICHRP. So there's some links there to join ICHRP in Canada or in the US. And again, we want to build a movement that can really make changes around these problems and contribute to our friends and partners in the Philippines. So thank you again so much for joining us today. And then we'll just let you know there's one final thing. July 6th is the expected date for the launch of the second report that will come out based off this last set of hearings. So you can keep an eye out for that and share that once it comes out. Thank you.